Section 6 of a Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nathaniel O'Coin. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. Little Red Riding Hood. All in a little cottage there lived a little maid, the sweetest little maid that ever was seen, and her mother loves her well, but her granny loves her better, and she had a little red hood, just like a little queen. Now, because this little girl wore a red cloak with a red hood, everybody called her Little Red Riding Hood. It chanced one day that her mother had made some custards and a little plum pudding, and she said, "Now take the little basket and the little custard too, and the little pudding boiled for your granny dear. But don't you stop or stay, do not idle on the way. On the high road, Little Red Riding Hood, will nothing have to fear." "Go," said her mother, "straight along to your grandmother, give her the nice things in your basket, and then come straight home again, and tell me how the old lady is. Mind, talk to no one on the way." So Little Red Riding Hood set off immediately to go to her grandmother, who lived in a cottage beyond the wood. Instead of taking the highway, she went through the wood, and there she met the old grey wolf, who wanted to eat her, but he durst not, for there were men in the wood making faggots. But he stopped her and said, "What have you got in your basket, my dear?" "Only some custard and plum pudding and a little pat of butter." "And where are you going, my dear?" "I'm going to see Granny." "Where does Granny live, my dear?" "In the cottage beyond the wood," answered Red Riding Hood. "And when you get to the cottage, what do you do?" "I knock at the door." "And what does your grandmother say?" asked the wolf. "She says, 'Who is there?'" answered the little girl. "And what do you do next?" "I answer and say, 'I am Little Red Riding Hood, and I have brought you a custard and plum pudding and a little pat of butter.'" "What does grandmother say, then?" inquired the wolf. "She says, 'Pull the bobbin and the latch will go up.'" Well, when the wolf heard this, off he ran as fast as he could, taking the nearest way, and the little girl, forgetting again her mother's commands, idled on the way, picking hazelnuts, running after butterflies, making posies of the wild flowers. The wolf was not long before he got to the old woman's door. He knocked. Tap, tap. "Who's there?" called a voice from within. "Your grandchild, Little Red Riding Hood," replied the wolf, imitating the child's voice as nearly as possible. "I have brought you a custard and a little plum pudding and a little pat of butter." The old grandmother, who was infirm and in bed, cried out, "Pull the bobbin and the latch will go up." The wolf pulled the bobbin, and the door opened, and then he fell on the poor old woman, and gobbled her up in a moment, for he had eaten nothing for many days. He shut the door, and jumped into the grandmother's bed, and pulled on the grandmother's nightcap, which he had not eaten, but had reserved, lest it should spoil his appetite for what was coming. Presently he heard Little Red Riding Hood's tap-tap at the door, so he called out, "Who is there?" "It is your grandchild, Little Red Riding Hood, who has brought you a custard and a little plum pudding and a little pat of butter." The wolf cried out to her, softening his voice as much as he could, "Pull the bobbin and the latch will go up." Little Red Riding Hood pulled the bobbin, and the door opened. The wolf, seeing her come in, drew the bedclothes up about his shoulders and said, "Put the custard and the plum pudding and the pat of butter on the table, and come and sit on the stool beside the bed and tell me how your mother is." "She is very well, thank you, Granny," answered the girl as she put the articles she had brought on the table. "Mother said I was to bring back the basket," she said, "so that she may be able to send you something nice in it again another day." "That is very good of your mammy. Come and sit on the stool, my dear." So Little Red Riding Hood came over and sat close by the bed, and she was much amazed to see how her grandmother looked. So she said, "Grandmamma, what great arms you have got." "The better to hug you, my dear." "Grandmamma, what a long nose you have got." The better to smell you, my dear. Grandmamma, what long ears you have got. The better to hear you, my dear. Grandmamma, what great eyes you have got. The better to see you, my dear. Grandmamma, what great teeth you have got. The better to eat you, my dear. Saying these words, the wicked wolf threw off the bedclothes, jumped out of the bed, and fell on Little Red Riding Hood to eat her up. But at that very moment, bang! Through the door a gun was fired, and the grey old wolf rolled over, shot through the head. Then in came the forester, and this was Little Red Riding Hood's father. He had seen the wolf hasting off in the same direction in which he saw afterwards his little daughter had gone, so thought the cunning and cruel beast was after mischief, and he hastened in the same direction with his gun. Poor Little Red Riding Hood was so frightened that she could not walk home, and could only sob and cling to her father, and so he carried her, and as he carried her he said, "A little maid must be afraid to do other than her mother told her. Of idling must be wary, of gossiping must be chary. She'll learn prudence by the time that she is older." Note: Little Red Riding Hood. One of Perrault's tales. The germ of this story may perhaps be traced in the Edda. In that is told the story of Thor visiting the Thurser, dressed in female garments, and representing himself as Freya, whom the Thurser has asked in marriage. At the wedding banquet, Thor drinks 3 barrels of mead. "Never did I see bride eat and drink so much," said the dismayed bridegroom. Then the Thurser attempted to kiss his bride and raise the veil. "Never did I see such fiery eyes before," he exclaimed and staggered back. Then he brought his hammer and laid it on his bride's knee, who at once struck him dead with it. Little Red Riding Hood is found in Germany, in Portugal, in Italy, etc. End of section 6. Recording by Nathaniel O'Coin.
Section 7 of A Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lillian Elizabeth. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. The Sleeping Beauty. Many years ago, there lived a king and a queen who had an only daughter, and she was so beautiful that at her birth the king knew not what to do for joy, and he appointed a great feast to celebrate it. He invited not only his relations and friends and his whole court, but also the wise women, in order that they might be kind and bestow favors upon the new-born princess. There were 13 of these women in his kingdom, but as he had only 12 gold trenchers for them to eat off, he could not invite them all. So one was left out. The 12 who were invited came, and when the feast was over, they began to bestow their wonderful gifts upon the child. One gave her virtue, a second beauty, a third riches, a fourth modesty, and so on with everything that is good and valuable in the whole world. But just as the 11th had finished bestowing her gift, in came the 13th, who had not been invited, and began to threaten vengeance for the affront which the king had put upon her. "The maiden," she said, "when she comes to her 15th year, shall pierce her hand with a spindle, and shall fall down dead." At this the king and queen were grieved beyond measure, but the 12th fairy, who had not yet bestowed her gift, stepped forward and spoke. She could not, indeed, she said, prevent what her sister had determined, but she could mitigate it. "The king's daughter," she continued, "shall not die, but shall fall into a deep sleep, which shall last 100 years, at the end of which time a king's son shall awaken her. And when she falls asleep, the whole palace will sleep with her." The king, who was very anxious, if possible, to ward off this misfortune from his dear child, made a proclamation that every spindle should be sent out of the kingdom, and that none should be seen all over the land until the princess had passed her 15th year. In the meantime, the wishes of the fairies came to pass, for the maiden grew up so beautiful, so modest, so amiable, and so intelligent that no one who saw her could help immediately loving her. Now it happened one day when she was nearly 15 years old that the king and queen went from home, and the young princess was left quite alone in the palace. She walked about through all the rooms and passages, and wandered hither and thither as her fancy led her, till at last she came to an old tower. Here she saw a narrow staircase, which she mounted, and then she came to a little door. In the lock of the door there was a rusty key, and when she turned it round, the door sprang open, and there she saw, sitting in the corner of a little room, a very old woman who was busily employed with her spinning wheel. "Ah, old granny," said the king's daughter, "what are you about there?" "I am spinning," answered the old woman, and nodded her head to the princess. "How merrily that thing goes round," spoke the maiden, taking the spindle in her hand at the same time. "Let me try if I can spin too." But scarcely had she touched the spindle when she pierced her hand with it, and the enchantment took effect. That moment she fell down and sank into a deep sleep. She was then carried to a chamber and laid upon a beautiful couch, and no sooner was this done than the king and queen and their servants and the whole court and everything about the castle fell asleep likewise. The horses and grooms slept in the courtyard or in the stalls, the dogs in the kennel, the pigeons on the roof, and the flies on the walls. Even the very fire which flamed upon the hearth became still and slept. The roast ceased to hiss, and the cook, who had caught the kitchen girl by the hair to punish her for some fault, let go her hold and fell asleep. And all that had the breath of life was still and slept. And now a hedge of thorns began to grow all round the castle, which hedge every year became higher and thicker until at last it closed in the whole building, and not even the chimney tops could be seen. And the story of the beautiful sleeping thorn rose, for thus was the princess named, was told throughout the land, so that from time to time many kings' sons came and tried to force their way through the hedge into the castle. But it was all in vain, for the boughs kept together as tightly as if they had clasped each other's hands, so that the youth stuck fast among the thorns and could not get out, and after struggling and tumbling about for a long time, they one by one died. After many long years had flown by, there came another king's son through the land, and he heard by chance from an old man the story of the thorn hedge and the king's sons who had been killed by it. The old man also told him how it was said that there stood a castle on the other side of the hedge, and in the castle the beautiful princess Thornrose slept, and with her the king and queen and the whole household. Then the youth said to him, "The thorn hedge shall not frighten me. I will force my way through it, for I am resolved to see the beautiful princess Thornrose, if it should cost me my life." But the day was now at hand when the 100 years were to expire, and the spell to be dissolved. And when the prince approached the hedge, the thorns appeared to his sight only large, beautiful flowers, which separated before him of themselves, and allowed him to pass through unhurt. And when he had passed, he saw them close themselves again and stand up like a great wall behind him. He entered the castle and looked around with him with astonishment. In the courtyard were horses with their grooms, fast asleep. The pigeons, too, sat sleeping upon the roof and hid their little heads under their wings. And when he came into the house, he saw the very flies asleep upon the walls. The cook held her hand as if she would seize the kitchen girl by the hair, and the maid sat with the black fowl before her, which she was going to pluck. He went on farther, and as he went, he saw the guards all asleep at their posts. Then he came into the great hall, and he saw all the courtiers sleeping there. He walked on again, and all was so still that he could hear his own breath. And at last he went up a winding stair, and opened the door of the chamber in which Thornrose slept, and not far from where she lay were the king and queen themselves. He went near to the princess, and as she lay there, all still and motionless, she looked so beautiful that he could not take his eyes off her. At last he stooped down and gave her a kiss. As soon as he had touched her cheek, Thornrose opened her eyes, woke up, and looked round her with a friendly smile. Then she arose, and the prince and she went down the stair together. And now the king and queen and the whole court awoke, and rubbed their eyes, and looked with wonder at each other. The horses also awoke, and neighed and shook themselves. The greyhounds sprang to their feet and wagged their tails. The doves on the housetop drew their heads from under their wings, looked round, and flew away into the meadow. The flies on the wall began to creep along. The fire in the kitchen flickered and flamed up. The roast began to hiss. The old cook gave the kitchen girl a box on the ear that made her scream. The maid, too, was seen busily plucking away at the fowl. To crown the whole, the wedding of Thornrose and the king's son was celebrated with great feasting and rejoicings, and they lived in peace and happiness all their days. Notes: The Sleeping Beauty. One of Perrault's tales. This is the Dornröschen of Grimm. This is almost certainly a nature myth of the earth sleeping in winter till kissed by the warm rays of the spring sun, and it betokens a northern origin. The spindle is the sleep thorn wherewith, in the Norse myth, the Valkyrie Brunhild was sent to sleep by Odin. In the ancient myth, the sleeping beauty was surrounded by the Waberlo, or wall of flame, till Sigurd came and released her. This myth has acquired fresh vitality from its adoption into Wagner's marvelous cycle of opera, The Ring of the Nibelungen. Perrault took the tale from the Pentamerone. End of section 7. Recording by Lillian Elizabeth.